but there's some great tables. And what we did is we took, as you'll recall, in our first basin implementation plan, and it was kindly and gently pointed out to us that we had 500 projects listed, and that maybe it would be helpful to the state water plan if we could narrow that list or help you all understand what at least the current priorities were within our basin. So we did two things. We developed a short list of what could be called basin-wide plan or basin-wide priority projects, things that matter to everybody from the top of the basin to the bottom, which is kind of surprising when you think about how big the basin is, that there are things that are that important up and down the basin. Those included the development of a stream management plan, the protection of Shoshone, which, as you all know, is a critical linchpin in the administration of the Colorado River. Same thing with the Grand Valley Roller Dam rehabilitation down in the Grand Valley. CRCA implementation. For many of us, we started this in some ways, in some respects, negotiating the CRCA and the water plan and all of these planning efforts kind of coincide with a lot of the goals that we were trying to achieve with negotiating the CRCA. And then obviously protect existing and future west slope uses. So those were ones that the entire basin could agree upon. They fit, virtually every one of those fit all 6 of those themes, met those goals that we were looking to achieve. So then we went ahead and also looked at each region and developed a total of 26 projects that were identified from the various regions. And what we did, which was unique, is that we didn't say, here's the criteria of how you prioritize for your region. But what the SGM team did really is to say, okay, how will you prioritize within your region what's important? The commonality was those 6 themes were always a commonality to those projects. But some of the regions used, is it ready to go? Is it shovel ready sort of approach? How far is it in the planning process? Is it funded to determine which ones rose to the top of that priority list for right now? The important thing in that, and I really want to stress from our perspective, is that top priority list is really ever changing. As we face new challenges, different projects may rise to the top as opportunities present themselves, whether those are joint use projects, particular funding sources, those kinds of things. We don't want to preclude reaching out and grabbing something that is a solid and important project, but maybe didn't make it onto this list. And we want to be careful not to say that we're excluding anybody as a result of having established kind of this top priorities list. Like I said, my other goal today was to get you guys ahead of schedule, because I could see, I sit on a number of boards and work as staff for a number of boards, and I could see that everybody was starting to look at how many emails have come in today. So I'm going to try to make this short and help you out. I can't get the accolades of the prior speaker, but at least I'll be brief. So I'd really like to conclude with kind of three points. The addition of a big or a large TMD in the basin would be damaging to the recreation-based economy, agriculture, and the environment. The overdevelopment of the river system poses a huge risk to water users on both sides of the Continental Divide, and I think that's one that we all need to think seriously about, is the hydrological risk that we're all taking on when we start looking at intermittent supply and things like that. And then the final one is that high conservation, reuse, and linking water supply to land use are in the best interest of Colorado. And I really think those 3 principles have found their way into the water plan in various forms. But I think it's important to maybe even take it as far as being very specific and very express about those types of goals for our state water plan. There's a concept in driving, I ride a motorcycle, there's a concept about overrunning your headlights. And I think we have to be careful. And what that relates to is that you're going faster than your headlights can see ahead of you. And I think we need to be very careful with this water plan and with discussion about future supplies and future development, that we're not allowing ourselves to go faster than our headlights really can let us see into the future. And I think we need to be careful about that. And I think that's probably something coming from my basin that we'd like to encourage the water plan to include, is this concept that just because it's a possibility in the future doesn't mean you can stop thinking about what you're doing right now and how that relates. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves on the possibilities to allow ourselves to create a larger gap rather than to try to bring that gap down. And with that, hopefully I am short on time. I have time for questions, and you guys can end your day a little earlier.
Thank you very much. Director George, do you have any comments?
I do. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl. Nice job. They kept handing it off to you, I guess, without asking. But you rose to the occasion, and you got worthy help there behind you. So
Yeah, no,
I think that the roundtable is right on track. I like the principles. All basins feel this way, but certainly this one does. That it's a really big chew. I mean, there's just lots there, and progress has been good, but it is just a beginning. And I think we all sense that, even though we're trying to get to a finish line of some kind, and I think we are in each of these plans, but it really mostly is setting the stage for the rest of the story. And this one admits that, and I like that. So good job.
And that's very much in keeping with what we were trying to do. We recognize one of the conversations was, well, we can change it, right? I mean, that's always part of the conversation because we know it's going to be iterative and we know that we're not done. Our sense of accomplishment is that we've made it this far, but there's a lot of work to do. And things like starting to work on the stream management plan are up in front of the roundtable now. So we're moving forward on those things that we've identified.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here. Jacob.
8H, last but not least, in any way, slight change to the agenda. Mary Brown is here in Jeff DeVere's stead to present the Yampa White Green Basin Implementation Plan. Thank you, Mary.
Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, directors. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I too will be quite brief and certainly can echo Director George's comment a moment ago that in the Yampa White Green, we have developed a plan, and it is a plan for moving forward rather than a plan that is completed. There have been relatively few changes from the plan that you heard about in July of last year. So I'm not going to go into significant detail about what you already know, but rather would like to focus on just a few things that did change over the course of the past several months. And probably most significant and least evident is the work that we did on the models that were used in the plan originally to identify shortages and then to scope out various scenarios that involved differing weather conditions, wet years, dry years, high demand, low demand, what happens when the energy sector pops, if it does, sort of things. And we did a lot of truth testing of those models so that sat through many meetings of both the roundtable, the BIP subcommittee, as well as public meetings in every community in both the white, Yampa and Green basins. And when you hold a community meeting in the Green Basin, you pretty much get 100% of the population to show up, which is really a lot of fun. But you also get people looking very closely at maps and saying, wait a minute, that's not how it works on this tributary that runs into this tributary and then eventually maybe gets to the river. So what we see in a great deal of this rather lengthy plan that contains many, many maps of varying scenarios are things that aren't going to be huge revelations to people who weren't familiar with all of that iterative information, but took a great deal of time to accomplish between July and the basin plan in April. So the characteristics of the basin very quickly and probably most distinctive about the Yampa White and Green were less developed relative to the other basins in the state. The water rights are relatively junior. There's not a great deal of storage, and we have no history of mainstream administration in the Yampa White or Green. So that puts us in a little bit of a different position as we move forward, looking at IPPs to address what we believe will be future needs. And as we look at this simplistic chart, what you can see is that the most significant factor in future needs for our basins, we believe, is the specter of increased energy development. It's really difficult to predict when that might occur, difficult to predict at what level it will occur. But if energy development is significant, then we also have increased need in the M&I sectors because people working in energy have to live somewhere. What may be somewhat unique about the Yampa White Green is that we did an agricultural needs assessment, and we identified places where agriculture could in fact be increased. So you see in this chart that agriculture also increases somewhat. So by and dry isn't as big a problem for us. Quite frankly, we see areas that we'd like to get more water to and have identified some IPPs that may be able to accomplish that. So we have kind of done, some basic concerns that you hear from every basin. We want to protect what's going on there now. We want to be able to have a prosperous future, not only in M&I and agriculture, but addressing the energy prospect as well. And we are looking for ways to manage risk, since we are a junior portfolio of water rights and have frequently been identified as perhaps the source for a new TMD if that should happen at some point. And so a great deal of the work moving forward is to take the 8 goals that the basin developed and were included in the draft you saw in July, and to begin to put together processes for achieving the goals, but also identifying measurable outcomes so that we are in fact paying close attention rather than conceptual attention to those things that we would like to achieve. The implementation plan since July has gone through some editorial changes, but is really quite similar to what you saw last July. We've made a few changes to some wording to clarify some positions, and then we added the next steps section. And that's really the only additional section in the plan from July. And our next steps revolve around firming up the modeling to identify the true storages for meeting current and future in-basin consumptive and significantly non-consumptive uses. We find in the Yampa White Green, similar to the main stem of the Colorado, that recreational economy, water quality, and the various support of riparian areas, as well as meeting the PBO in the Yampa and the prospective PBO in the White, we have much more than just consumptive needs. We really need to pay attention to non-consumptive needs as well. We find that frequently our models give us some kind of counterintuitive information when we have looked at implementing IPPs in various weather scenarios. In some cases, shortages were exacerbated after we developed an IPP. In other words, we might meet one goal, but then exacerbate shortages in the non-consumptive arena while we were trying to meet a consumptive need. So significant effort in making certain that as we look toward the implementation of some of the IPPs, that we make certain we're not cutting off our nose to spite our face. And finally, we are about to launch phase 2 of our agricultural needs study. And it's going to look at what happens if we implement what many people like to call agricultural efficiencies. By and large, in the Yampa White and Green, we flood irrigate out of ditches with a shovel. And there is a significant suggestion that sprinkler irrigation would be more efficient and perhaps more effective. But there is also great concern in the basin that the change to the return flow regime, in fact, might do more harm than good. So we have just embarked on a scoping study to figure out how we might begin to evaluate those return flow situations. And we have taken a look at a project that it perhaps could be a demonstration of that, a project where a rancher in the White wants to install sprinkler irrigation and will allow us kind of a on-the-ground laboratory study of how that might work. So that's it in a nutshell. And I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mary. Director Gallagher, do you have any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mary. That was a very good, concise presentation of where we are. I just wanted to reiterate that the basin is committed to this process and will remain committed. We appreciate the support of the CWCB. And actually, next week, we are going to have our first meeting on the implementation phase for this phase 2. And we are talking about, we actually have committed to a retreat to take on some of the knottier issues that we can't seem to address in our late night roundtable sessions. So we're going to be doing a 2-day session presumably in Meeker now, I think is the venue. So that will be in July, either just before or just after our meeting in Ignacio in July. But thank you.
Thank you, Director Gallagher. Any other comments? I do have one comment. I noticed that your opening photograph was of Mather's Hole, and the Director Gallagher took the picture. At least you're credited with it. Is that named after Mr. Mathers, that was the county commissioner in that area? Do you know, or?
I don't. I'm not sure it was.
I know he owned a bar.
It was Tom.
Yeah.
He did own a bar, and I'm not sure it was Tom,
Okay.
but it may have been his predecessors. Yes.
Okay, great. Those family connections in rural Colorado
There,
are
another picture?
part of our heritage. Actually, it was the opening picture of the Mathers Hole, but I like that picture too.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Mary. Jacob.
Well, let's give everybody a big
Yes.
round of applause.
This was clearly a huge lift by the basin implementation plans. And for agenda item 8, capital B, the board has asked us to talk about the roadmap. I'm going to be brief and then turn it over to Director Eklund for a few additional words. Obviously, the basin implementation plans are already looking forward as to what the next steps are. And of course, you saw some of them are thinking about incorporating SWAZI. This next iteration of SWAZI, of course, will want to engage the basin implementation plans, of course, or the basin roundtables. Of course, the basin roundtables will continue to fund water supply reserve account grants and be a public forum for policy discussions and education and outreach. I think that the big question is how the roundtables can transition to become an implementation catalyst. And I believe we're going to need the board's help in shaping that. Director Eklund, do you have some comments?
Thank you, Jacob. That's well said. I think if we get headed in the right direction here, then what that's going to take is all the board members going back to your respective basins and talking to the folks that just did the heavy lift here and gathering where they want to head with this. What do they see their next steps? What does implementation look like for them? We heard a pretty good articulation of that from the Arkansas Basin. But to be fair to the other basins, we haven't made the ask. So we need to do that. Director King laid this out at our last meeting, as did Director McLeod. And I think if that can be our homework for the July meeting, then when we come back in July, we can have a pretty good articulation of what it is that each basin is expecting to do moving forward. Obviously, there's part of that is the WSRA grant and funding piece, but there's also this implementation and project prioritization piece as well. So if that meets, I think that would be our recommendation, would be that course of action. But we've got some time for a conversation if anybody differs or wants to add to that.
Director George.
Yeah, I think there's more homework too than what you've articulated. Two points come to mind very quickly on this. One is that if you're going to implement these plans, you have to have money. That's one. And you have to have staff. That's two. I think to imagine that these roundtables can go forward in implementation phase, begging and borrowing on volunteers and CWCB staff to do these, I think is short-sighted on our part. That, now you begin to get into some serious government conversations, and what's that going to look like, and how does that fit with the conservation districts and the conservancy districts and the other special districts all in the same area, and that can become a local size of government conversation, and I think we ought to start worrying about that ourselves, and what we've started here, and how does it morph now, and because we have responsibility for this. This is an essence, one of the essential points of what started here a long time ago. That the key was, we said to the local communities, tell us what you need, and so they've done that. And if there's ever to be anything that elevates in the nature of a functioning state water plan, it has to rest upon the accomplishments in the basins. So I think we've got kind of another big lift on our part. And so we need to start thinking about that, and maybe have some pre-work done to have the discussion next time, not just hand it over to the locals and say, tell us what you want and you're good. I don't think that's going to make it. Though I'm very interested to hear the messages back. Then the rest of the story is, how are we going to try to position ourselves to assure an ongoing appropriate amount of funds coming from legislature? Because once you start these projects, you have to be sure you can fund them, and I think that one gets really worrisome. So these are the things that I'm wrestling with as I start thinking about this.
Thank you, Director
Thank you,
George.
Director George. I'm sorry, Director Hamill first, and then Director Montgomery.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Director Eklund's comments, Jacob's comments, and the father of this, Director George's comments are right on. And I think as we go, some of the volunteers are wore out. We don't want to lose them or their replacements because they play an important part of it. But if I can use, is Jay Winter still in the room?
Yes.
Okay, he's back here. He's hiding behind Jacob. Maybe I'll use him as an example to a point that Director George made is, we've had a lot of volunteers that leave their farms or their own businesses. We've had water districts, municipalities offer support. I'm sure we'll still get that. But if you take the work that Jay's done on the road, going out and helping small communities within his district, pointing them in the right direction, calling on CWCB staff, whether it be our finance people, our planning people, on how you might approach a project, it seems like we're at a point that we need additional staffing, and it might work, and we may float to this board in September or earlier a potential grant request to put together some type of thing to fund a contractor that could help us coordinate. Because I think more of the small communities, the small environmental groups, how do you put multi-purpose projects together? How do you put regional projects together to really make the implementation a quality implementation plan and to move it forward? And And as some of the, you see what WISE has started, we have something, just foundational WISE, just getting started to pour the foundation in El Paso County, but it's going to need more work. And it's collaboration, cooperation, and bringing a lot of entities. But if you look down in the lower basin, with the 40 communities that are going to be part of the Arkansas Valley Conduit, in many cases, we had some system failures, and here's a small community that doesn't know how to plan, doesn't have the people or the resources, but maybe their neighbor in communities, you can put small units together to do area-wide projects and at the same time make them multi-purpose projects. And so I think that this discussion is very timely, it's needed, and that we keep this whole process moving forward, but probably is going to need to be tweaked a bit. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Director Montgomery.
This is Director Eklund. I'd like a little more clarification since it looks like I think my representatives had to leave. What are you looking for exactly? What do you want from us, from our roundtable?
Yeah.
And do you want it by July, or you want us to discuss it in July?
Well, I think it depends on your particular basin. Some of them meet every other week. Some of them meet quarterly. So it depends on how you can glean this information from them. It might be through the basin implementation plan reception or something like that gives you the avenue to talk to them about this. But the homework is to go to the members of your roundtable and ask them what they view in terms of, do they have some sort of conceptualization of what the next step looks like for them? If they do, then they'll, I'm sure, tell you. And if they don't, they can, that's fine too. But we need to kind of take the pulse, is the direction that we got from the board last meeting, take the pulse of those basin roundtables. And then the heavy lift that Director George alluded to begins. And we have to start wrestling with what we're going to do structurally to make sure that we've got a successful project or a successful implementation process.
Got it.
Does that make sense to everybody? Yep. Clear as mud.
Director King.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair, it's just kind of an interesting moment for me today listening to this discussion. And sometimes I think we're so caught up in how this has evolved in the day to day, and we're all up to our eyeballs in it. But one thing hit me today that I think we need to step back and think about how far this discussion has come since we began this process. And what jumped out at me, I remember it must have been 2.5, 3 years ago at an IBCC meeting, someone raised out loud this idea that, by God, we need to tie land use to water availability. And it was kind of a flinch in the room because it was a third rail. And it was one of those things that kind of people understood, but you didn't talk about because it was so volatile. And so it had the potential to cause people to get up and leave. We have the same thing with Trans Mountain diversions. And today we have the Grand Junction Daily Sentinel editorial board saying, Russ George is right. We need to take this head on. It's another one of those third rail issues that we have, through this process, brought out into the open. We're having candid, honest discussions. And every one of the base implementation plan said we need to be looking at land use as it relates to water availability. So all of a sudden, these things are kind of congealing. And of course, ultimately, I think those two issues will come together, and we will have a discussion that if, as part of the conceptual framework, there ever is to be a Trans Mountain diversion, in addition to a bunch of other things, the receiving basin darn well better have extremely tight land use regulations relative to growth. So when they use this water, it is used in a way that is responsible. So all of these things are coming together, and I just hope we're not losing sight of the fact that this dialogue has moved a long, long way in the last 3 years. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Director Eklund,
Yep.
any
So
comments?
I think taking that back, when you go and you pull your basin roundtable, taking back what Director King just said, it's definitely true for me. You get right up next to the weeds and it's tough to see the entire landscape. And if you can, I guess that's part 2 of the homework is pull them, but also remind them that we've come a long way and what we're capable of. I mean, if we can do this, then there are very few things that we can't tackle. This is water in the West. So I full on endorse Director King's comments there. And I think with that, if you guys are all okay with the homework you've been assigned, we can reserve some time in July to have the next conversation.
Jacob?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Director Eklund, Director King, all the directors.
Great. Well, thank you all for your presentations again. And I know this morning we cut the break a little bit short, so I'm going to put us into recess for 10 minutes to take another little break to make up for this morning. And, yes. So we're in recess.
You didn't find that.